is always a pleasure.
The dignity and worth of human personality.
Hello, I'm Davia Brown.
I'm Brandon Lyles.
And I'm Stacy Loveland, and we're excited to have you join us for Colonial Williamsburg's CW Kids Ask,
Where we dive deep into history.
Together, we'll explore 18th century life and connect it to present-day experiences.
We'll look at everything from fashion to science.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. I am Brady Lanier, and this is Jennifer Edenborn.
Hello.
And we are members of the Governor's Music, Colonial Williamsburg's resident performing Baroque ensemble. We are here to show you and tell you about the bowed string instruments owned by Colonial Williamsburg that are curated by our collections department. We are here in the Colonial Williamsburg Collections Conservation Lab. This is where the curators care for the antique items in our possession. We'll tell you a little bit about the history of both the instruments themselves and their role here at Colonial Williamsburg, and best of all, play you some music on them that would have been available to 18th century residents of Williamsburg. We'll make time for a few questions at the end of our session, so please write them down in the comments.
Well, thank you, Brady. I will talk a little bit about the history of just playing music at Colonial Williamsburg, beginning with the restoration in the 1920s, of course. I have to thank, for refreshing my memory, John Watson, who's the recently retired conservator and curator of musical instruments here, because he wrote a book about the keyboard collection called Changing Keys. This was published in 2013. It has a very nice preface to the book, which goes through the history of recreating 18th century music here at Colonial Williamsburg. And it's very interesting if anybody wants to read that. I'll touch on a couple of points. We're talking about some instruments that were collected here, for the most part, instruments that were bought, these stringed instruments, in the 1960s. Earlier in time, in the 1930s, actually was the first attempt to recreate music here. Interestingly, the grandniece of American President Martin Van Buren, Lotte Van Buren, was very interested in early keyboard instruments, and she sold one of her pianos to Colonial Williamsburg in 1930. So that was the first historical instrument that was bought here. It was an early 19th century piano. And after that, many keyboard instruments were collected over the 1930s, and she also advocated for beginning to recreate 18th century concerts in the then newly reconstructed Governor's Palace. So they started having concerts. At first they invited musicians from New York and brought people in, sometimes very famous people. And then in the late 1940s, local musicians kind of took over, and there was a body of performing musicians here that played in the palace for over 30 years. That started in the late 40s and went up to 1980, in the 1980s. And the four very fine Italian, well, one's English, but 2 violins and a viola and a cello were purchased during the 1960s for use by these musicians in the palace orchestra. And what we're going to talk about a little bit with these instruments is the fact that with earlier violins, they actually had modifications made to them in the 19th century to make them modern instruments. But we're very concerned about that today because of something we call usually something historical performance practice. That's a term that just indicates that we're very concerned about trying to play music as it was actually heard and played by people of the actual time. So, but in the 1960s, people weren't that concerned about that. The violin, cello, and the viola had been altered and modernized. So we're going to talk about that in a couple of videos that we made that explains this to people in a little more detail. But there's been a concern and a really enthusiasm for playing on instruments from the collection. I have here an indication of a recording that was made, instrumental music from the Colonial Williamsburg collection, just showing the picture here. This is this violin, the cross violin. It's an English instrument that has not been altered. Its neck hasn't been altered before. And this recording was made in 1987 by then practitioners of early music here. Jock Darling and Tom Marshall are on this recording, also Herb Watson playing early flutes from the collection, and Kevin Boucher playing baroque violin. It's a very, very nice recording from 1987. So we're way past that now, and getting more. We've done a lot of research, and now today we call ourselves the Governor's Music, and we're very, very concerned with playing on the original instruments as they were. So watch these videos that gives you a little more information about that. These two instruments are both 18th century violins. They're interestingly different in the way that one instrument has been unaltered in terms of its neck setup from its earlier state. And one instrument has been what was thought at the time to be improved, and it was improved in order to keep up with modern music. So the changes that were made were to the neck and the strength of the bass bar and sound post inside. But they're interesting to play if you play early music or historically informed performance practice music. You get more comfortable with the earlier setup of the violin, whereas a player who is playing modern music is more comfortable with the modern setup of the violin. This is possibly an English instrument, possibly a German instrument, but it's very interestingly has its neck, which I'll turn it this way, which comes straight out from the violin and has a wedge placed in the fingerboard. And when violins were first built, came on the scene in the 1500s, the early instruments, well, first of all, they're not standardized as our modern instruments are, but the neck is set in this way, straight onto the violin, and the fingerboard is shorter. Things like tailpieces and bridges are all replaced constantly on violins. This has a hybrid kind of modern / early type tailpiece on it, which is flatter. The bridges were generally smaller and rounder, and the bass bar and the sound post inside a bit lighter construction than the replacement bass bar and sound post on the modern violin, the modernized violin. This instrument is a very fine example of an Italian instrument from the 18th century. It's attributed to Tommaso Balestrieri. And this has been altered to keep up with modern music. So it has the longer neck and fingerboard built onto the instrument. When the old fingerboards and necks are removed, they save the scroll, and that is spliced back onto the new neck. So this adjustment was made to many fine old instruments in the 19th century. And sometimes people don't know that a modern violin, even if it is an old violin, it can have been modernized this way. But the instruments are well known for their power and their ability to project. And I think the finest makers, when they were first making these instruments, were making instruments that had a sweetness of tone, and they could also project. That was one of the things that the violin could do as compared to the viol. When the violin first developed, it was thought of as a rather low-life instrument played in taverns and for dancing, because it could project, it was louder. And then these makers in the 1500s, the 1600s, just raised the level of violin making to a very high art. So I'll show these instruments next to each other like this. You can see a little bit the difference in the construction of the neck, where the instrument has been modernized and where it's been left alone with its 18th century shorter neck and fingerboard. These violins are both 18th century instruments, but they're quite different when you play them, in that one has been modernized and one still has its original neck. They're both very fine instruments, and we love having the opportunity to play on them from time to time.
So this is our cello. It is an 18th century English instrument. There's some uncertainty about the maker. Some say it was attributed to the Walmsley shop, but that's unknown. It is definitely a period instrument, though. It has a lovely wood grain. If you can see, there's some worm damage here and there, which I think adds to its charm, as long as it's taken care of and repaired in a timely manner. It also has been modernized. As you can see, it has a quite long 19th century fingering board, and the neck is at the modern angle. Another modernization on the cello is its end nub right here. It has a hole for an end pin. It doesn't have an end pin in right now. That's the spike that comes out of modern cellos. The cello did not acquire an end pin until the 19th century, but we do play it in the 18th century manner, so I don't actually use the end pin. I just, it's just an empty hole for where it could be right now. I'm going to turn it over so you can see the back of the instrument. It is some lovely wood in this instrument. It's also been around the block. You can see there's been a number of cracks that have been repaired here and there. This is a not uncommon thing that happens to string instruments, particularly as they age over centuries, is that they acquire some battle damage that a competent repair person then can go inside the instrument and fix up. Again, not a fatal flaw. It just kind of adds to its 18th century charm. The strings, I'll tell you a little bit about the strings. You can see that we're using strings that are made out of gut. This is animal intestine that's been dried and separated into fibers and twisted and braided in various historically informed ways. The bottom two thicker strings also have a gut core. They are wrapped with silver wire, which was done in the 18th century. They are also gut strings. Strings don't tend to last more than a few months for the top ones to, maybe a year or two for the bottom strings. So strings do need to be replaced frequently. That is the English 18th century cello. So I hope you enjoyed that. A valuable source of information on the musical repertoire available to 18th century residents of Williamsburg is a series of advertisements placed in the Virginia Gazette in 1771 and 72 by the post office, listing various items imported from London for sale, including sheet music. And I think we have it off. It is off. That happened. This is how you know it's live. Let's just try that again, shall we? A valuable source of information on the musical repertoire available to 18th century residents of Williamsburg is a series of advertisements placed in the Virginia Gazette in 1771 and 72 by the post office, listing various items imported from London for sale, including sheet music. And we have an image to share with you here. Yay. Most of the sheet music for sale at the post office was published in London in the 1750s and 60s, London, of course, being our primary, if not only, trading partner in the colonies. At that time, there was a growing demand for printed music, particularly chamber music, that is, music written for a small number of players, typically between 1 and 4 or so. This published music was intended to be played in the home by skilled amateurs and was meant to appeal to the general public. We now call it domestic music. Harpsichords, flutes, and violins were all popular instruments here in Williamsburg amongst the gentry, that is, the people who had the time and the money to pursue musical activities. Musical training was a valued quality in a gentleman, and many members of the gentry had had musical education from early childhood. Most of the sheet music for sale was by German and Italian composers who were writing in the international galant style, which was in vogue in the middle decades of the 18th century. So galant music, not a word you hear often today, it's characterized by lightly accompanied, symmetrical, highly ornamented short phrases and tends to possess a simple ease and gracefulness. In fact, the French philosopher Voltaire said that its main objective was to please. Hopefully our music will be pleasing. We are going to play for you a piece mentioned in the 1771 post office ad, listed there as Barbella's Duets. Emanuel Barbella was a violinist and a composer based in Naples who published his 6 solos for a violin and bass in London in 1765. And we have a photo of the title page here, I think, that you can look at. Notice how the piece is advertised as being playable for a violin and a bass or 2 violins. This is to increase its marketability and was a common ploy amongst composers of music for the domestic market. Played for 2 violins, or violin and flute, or violin and oboe, or violin and clarinet, or buy me, buy me, buy me. That was kind of the subtext, right? So if you look at the bottom of the page, there's even a chart to help violinists read from the bass clef, which they don't usually do. So now we're going to play for you the second movement of Barbella's first duet. It's called Andante Gustoso. was the Barbella duet. Hopefully that was pleasing in the true gallant style. At this point, we're going to take one question from the audience, so let's hear it.
Hello, this is Brody Adams, producer with Trades Tuesday, and I'll be delivering your questions to our performers today. Our first question comes from Aaron, who would like to know what are some of your favorite pieces from the 18th century to play?
Do you have one?
Ooh, oh, that's interesting.
I mean, I play a lot of viola da gamba. That's my main act. So, you know, Carl Friedrich Abel comes to mind. Abel is a lot of fun to play. He was known as the last virtuoso of the viol, active in the 1770s and 1780s. He had a concert series that he ran together with, it was J.C. Bach, right?
Yeah.
Johann Christian Bach, one of J.S.'s many sons. I think perhaps the youngest son?
Youngest.
Yeah, the youngest son. Anyway, a fantastic composer for the viol. That's what off the top of my head. If you ask me 5 minutes later, I might give you a different story. What do you think, Jenny?
Well, I think I have to say I have different favorites at different times, but I really love Telemann. I guess
Good choice.
Georg Philipp Telemann. He's my favorite. I mean, he's written so much music, you can never run out of music to play by Telemann, and nothing's ever bad. It's just all great. He wrote wonderful pieces that you can play on either violin or flute sometimes, so it's just unlimited music for the violin. You can steal the flute music and play that too.
He wrote for the viol, too, so we like him, too.
Yeah, he was great.
He was
Unbelievable.
Great composer. Good choice, yeah. Good question. Shall we plow on ahead? What's next?
Yeah. Well, we're going to...
it's my turn.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's right. Oh, we're going to talk about the viola.
It's time to talk about the viola, yes. So perhaps, I hate to be qualitative, but perhaps the nicest instrument we have here is a very highly prized viola by the maker Gasparo da Salò, who was born in 1540. He was one of the earliest makers of the modern violin. To put it in perspective, when this, during our colonial revolutionary times in the late 18th century, this viola would have already been about 200 years old. Anyway, Da Salò and Andrea Amati have at various times been credited with inventing the violin, although records show that the violin did exist in some form earlier in the century, and Amati predates Da Salò by a couple of decades. But Da Salò and Amati also represent the archetypes of two schools of Italian violin craftsmanship. Da Salò was based in Brescia, and Amati was based in Cremona, which was a city later famous for being Stradivarius's workplace. Da Salò was born Gasparto Bertolotti and later took the name of Salò, which was his birth town. But he moved permanently to Brescia, which was by that time already a center of bowed string instrument craftsmanship. So Da Salò, in addition to making, he made violins, viola da gambas of a rather interesting design. I think we have a photo of one of Da Salò's viols. Viols, I should note, are a six-string cousin to the cello and violin. If you'll notice on this particular viol, notice its flared waist with a beveled corners. Very interesting design detail. He made at least one cello, and he also made some highly prized double basses, such as the one owned by the famed bassist Dragonetti, and we have a picture of the Dragonetti bass as well. If you're ever lucky enough to go to Venice, I don't want to brag or anything, but I've seen this bass myself, because it's on display at the Basilica di San Marco there in Venice. So if you ever go check out the Dragonetti bass, it's a very famous instrument. Only has 3 strings, too. Interesting detail, which points out that at this point in time, the details of instrument craftsmanship were still very much in flux. There was no normal way of designing instruments until a little bit later on. Anywho, where was I? Da Salò was, however, best known for his violas, which comprised the majority of his output, and many of which survive in playable condition today. They're very highly sought after by many top professionals. Many of Da Salò's violas were built to a larger size than what would become the standard. Many of these instruments were then cut down to smaller sizes by later luthiers. We have a video, and I'll talk a bit more about this in the video in a moment. This is most likely the fate of the instrument that is owned in CW's possession. But the Da Salò violas are prized for their superior tone. They're described as being full and reedy with a strong response. And many later luthiers would model their violas after Da Salò. So even though the Cremonese school of violin making would later prove dominant in later centuries, the Brescians left their mark through Da Salò's violas. So here's our Da Salò video. So this is a da Salò viola. It is probably been resized from its original construction. Violas at that time period were often made, and da Salò in particular would often make quite large instruments. The viola is a tenor-sized violin. It is tuned a perfect fifth lower than the modern violin. It needs to be larger usually than the human shoulder can comfortably accommodate to properly amplify that pitch range. So there's always been this tension in viola construction between playability and the proper acoustic size. So it is a little smaller, which means that the purfling, this wooden carving that you can see around the sides of the instrument, is likely not original. That would have been added after the resizing would have been done. The instrument has also been modernized. This is a contemporary angle for the neck, or I should say 19th century angle, and a longer sized fingering board as well, which would make this very prized for a modern symphony player, but altered from its original construction appearance. It has a very fine wood. Da Salò violas are still very prized today. There's a number of contemporary musicians, very, very prominent viola players who seek out da Salò instruments. Here's the back side of the instrument, so you can see the wood grain here. It's really lovely. That is the da Salò viola.
Thank you, Brady. It was very interesting. Well, we have another sample of music from the genre of music that Brady was talking about earlier. That is music that was available right here in town at the post office for purchase. And this composer is named Charles Campioni. Probably his most well-known claim to fame in our day is that he was one of Thomas Jefferson's absolute favorite composers. Thomas Jefferson loved Campioni, and he owned all his music for strings, and Jefferson also compiled a thematic catalog of Campioni's compositions that is still used by scholars today. And we're going to play one movement from Campioni's 6 duets for a violin and violoncello, published in London in 1769. This is an Allegro risoluto.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. We'll just leave it with that. And I think at this point, we're going to take some questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Christy here, who would like to know if the pocket fiddle was played in 18th century Williamsburg.
Well,
You take
you know,
that
speaking
one.
of Thomas Jefferson, I believe Thomas Jefferson owned a number of pocket fiddles, or pochette, French for pocket, or we also call them a kit sometimes, a K-I-T. But they were very, very popular in the 18th century. You could just throw them in your saddlebag, and they're also used by dancing masters, so called a dancing master's kit. Because if you were teaching dancing, you could just kind of line out the dance so that the dancers could hear it. But the little kit instruments don't have a lot of sound, but you can mark the dance on the kit. But I imagine they were also really, really useful as practice instruments. So sometimes you think of if you go on a trip and you want to practice, and you can put a practice instrument in your suitcase. So some people do that.
For those who don't know, she's talking about a little tiny violin. Is the string length the same as a normal violin? Is the string length even
Well, also
shorter?
there are different styles. So some of them
Okay.
are longer. The Stradivarius, speaking of the great Italian makers, Stradivarius made kits. So there's a Stradivari model, and then there's the tiny little violin model, which is the kind,
Which
it's
have
called
a-
the Jefferson
yeah.
model
Oh,
now.
really?
So, yeah.
But
they're
they don't have a
different size-
full-size body, so that the tone they make is very, very quiet and, you know, very, you know, really, really not meant for public performance. You know, just barely enough sound to, you know,
Yeah,
coach a room
ideally,
full of dancers.
ideally the fingerboard part is the same as a
Right,
full-size violin.
right. So you don't have to learn a new set
Yeah.
of fingerings.
I have one, and it's kind of
Yeah.
messed up because the fingerboard's a little bit too small. So it should have a full-size fingerboard.
Full-size fingering board, but
Right.
very reduced body. Yeah. Good question.
Great, thank you. William would like to know a little bit more about the bows that you're using and when the style of bow started to change from the 18th century style that you're using here to the modern style of bow.
You want me to?
Yes,
do
you
that
take
one?
that one,
Okay.
'cause you're very
That
good at
That is a
doing-
good question. So both Jenny and I are playing on 18th century model bows that are now popularly called baroque bows.
You can see them.
It just so happens I have my my more contemporary bow to put them side by side, so you can get a little bit of an idea of the differences. The two biggest differences. I'm going to tighten this bow a little bit so you can get a better picture. If you look at the tip of the bow, you can see that my baroque bow comes to more of a point, and the later period bow has a much more flared tip. The result in that is that the modern bow is more convex. Is that the right word? I always get these confused. No, concave. It goes in like this, and the baroque bow has more of an arch to it. This bow is better at playing long legato lines. This puts more tension at the tip. So the goal of this bow is to have an even sound throughout the bow. Whereas that is not the purpose of the baroque bow. The baroque bow really, and baroque playing in general, makes use of the stronger, you know, where the bow is heavier is where you hold it. This is going to be a stronger part of the bow to play. The tip is going to be a weaker part of the bow to play. So we very much think about strong and weak, metric accents, if you will. That's very much an idiomatic part of baroque playing, which is helped by the equipment we use. As for the time period, Francois Tourt was the bow maker credited for coming up with this design. And I don't have his dates in front of me, but I think he straddled 1800. So it really was, you know, as we went into the 19th century, that's when Tourt-style bows became the norm. And certainly when you get into the romantic style of playing into the middle of the 19th century, when you get into the 19th century, you would not have seen, you know, this style of bow. You would have only seen the Tourt style of bow. Am I leaving anything important out here?
Oh, that was great.
Thank you, Jenny. I appreciate that. So that's that.
All right, well, we've covered the bows. Susie would like to know more about the strings. In particular, are these strings on the violin made of gut? And would changing the strings to modern style strings change the sound very much? And in what way would that sound change?
We can both answer that, I think. I'll start with the violin.
I mean, I talked about gut strings in the cello video, so
okay.
it's the same for the violin.
Some
right?
things are very similar to what modern classical players use because the gut string is still the ideal in terms of the warmth of sound. But in more modern strings, there are ways of technically getting a warm gut string sound using synthetic materials or with different kinds of music, using, say, a metal strings for bluegrass because it's more harsh, it's louder, well, if you want to be heard. and different people using different kinds of strings. So the gut strings are still around, and people still use them. But in general, the difference that you might find looking right out of violin, if a person is using the performance practice, you might notice the little knots at the bottom. So the gut string is just plain, it's sheep's gut. That's the ideal animal to be used. Use all parts of the sheep. And the intestines used for strings. And strings, of course, gut strings were used for different things. In the 18th century, hat makers used them, and clock makers used them with the pendulum. And suture, used for suture. And so, but you'll see that on the Baroque style violin, the earlier violin, you tend to use just the plain string, and it's tied on with a knot. And our modern gut strings, well, they had the technology for wrapping the string with metal, though, already earlier in the 17th century. So the bottom string is generally wrapped.
18th century.
18th century. I thought late 17th, early 18th.
Maybe.
And so wrapping the string with metal allows the volume, the thickness of the string on the G to be a little bit thinner. If you used a plain gut on the G, it's very, very thick. But some people like to use the plain G. So it's just tied on with little knots, so that is different. But people still do use gut strings today.
Right. They tend to be a softer, gentler sound, so it depends. If you're a symphony player, you probably, what do I know, probably aren't going to be playing on gut strings. And if you're a soloist,
Really?
you want something, you think, because they just don't project.
Well, no, people use, well, anyway.
Really? You would know more than I would.
No, I
Okay,
don't.
if you say so.
Terrestrial.
I personally don't know a lot of modern players who use gut strings. They usually use metal or maybe synthetic.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. They don't use gut strings. Mostly. Okay, don't flame me if I'm wrong, string players. I know you're watching.
I think people use different combinations, too. Sometimes people mix
Sure.
it up. They'll use a metal E, perhaps a gut D, or a gut A, and then the metal G. So people mix up their sets to get the best sound.
All right, thank you. We have a question from a student at Navy Elementary School in Fairfax who would like to know the average cost of a violin in the 18th century, or I guess either of your instruments in the 18th century.
Oh, wow. There's a real variety, just as there is today. You can go on eBay and get a violin, or you can
She's
go
asking
into...
about the 18th century, though.
I know,
Oh,
but
you
it
know,
was...
you know.
but-
Okay.
Yeah. But so if you look at inventories of violins, you might see a person passes away. It says in one old fiddle or one violin, £1 or less than that, a certain number of shillings. And then you might find, in the case of Thomas Jefferson, again, he bought an instrument from his cousin John Randolph and spent a lot of money on that violin. So there's a huge variety, even in the 18th century, as there is today. So.
I'm glad you know. That's a good question.
How about cellos or viola?
No clue. Don't ask me. Yeah, good question.
Yeah, that is a
and
good question.
That ties in really well with another question we have from Matt, who would like to know if enslaved people would have any instruments and how might they gain access to those instruments.
That's also a good
Yeah,
question.
very good question. You go ahead and-
Do you want me to? Okay. Feel free to jump in. Yes.
We've both been reading.
It's true. But there are many records of enslaved people playing on the violin. In fact, mostly when you would go to a dance, the music would have been provided by an enslaved person or an indentured servant. Providing music for dances was the role of servants, not a gentry person. We know this from many mentions of violin playing from runaway slave ads. Musical ability was considered a defining feature of their subjects, and so it might say so-and-so, plays upon the violin, or so-and-so, able to work at the carpenter's trade and make his own violins, or so-and-so, I gave him a violin and he ran away with it. So there's, I think, over 80 instances of mention of musical ability within a very narrow time frame, just in the Virginia Gazette, mind you. So this was a very, very regularly occurring phenomenon. People would have expected that, in the 18th century. Good question.
Another question about just who is playing this kind of music in the 18th century. Would women be playing these instruments in public or just in the home?
Well, the problem with the violin family of instruments is the bow position. So the violin was considered really until the late 19th century, when it got to be kind of all the vogue for young ladies to play the violin, it was not considered a ladies' instrument. So young ladies, yes, they would play music, they would play a keyboard, they would sing, they would play a guitar, which could be held in the lap. But violin itself, viola, and the cello, the bow hold is overhand this way, which causes you to move your arm in an awkward way for being properly presented, properly dressed as a young lady. So interestingly enough, comparing violin and cello, viola, like the cello and the viola da gamba, viola da gamba, the viol family, the bow is held underhand, very graceful, and this was perfectly
so you can hold
fine.
your bow, you can keep your arms down by your side and look very graceful. There's many examples of 18th century artwork of women playing the viol with their very low-cut garments, looking very, very ladylike, so you don't disrupt this oval around the face. Isn't
Right.
that the theory? You know,
Yeah.
the violin, you're contorting your features, it really disrupts this line. But the viol, you know, again, you looking very proper. Even just this little adjustment when I play the cello, this overhand here, now I have to have my elbow up. It's kind of ugly, unattractive. I mean, for an 18th century woman, you know, we don't even get into gender roles and how annoying they are, but that was the thought process at the time.
Yeah, the two probably most popular instruments for gentlemen were the violin and the flute. So if you're this transverse flute, the second part of the 18th century, it's kind of, you know, very ugly to blow into an instrument, but also, as Brady was saying about the ideal picture of your face in this whole area, I mean, why get all dressed up and then cover it up? You know, so, and also, playing a wind instrument, you have something right in front of your face. So they were considered, wind instruments and violins were considered for men.
All right. We have another question coming in from Navy Elementary in Fairfax. They would like to know, has the wood used to make these instruments remained the same from the 18th century to now, or has it changed much?
No, it's the same.
It's absolutely the same.
The top tends to be of a spruce, which is a softer wood, and the ribs in the back are made from a maple, which has this nice flame, which is a much harder wood. What might be a bit different, this has, again, as I mentioned in the video, a modern fingering board. Modern fingering boards tend to be made from an ebony or ebony type wood. That was not always the case in the 18th century.
Yeah,
Do you know more
this
about
is
that?
actually a lighter color,
Right.
if you can see up close. Not sure what, this has a stain on it though, so not sure what wood this fingerboard is made of, but there is a real variety. Any hardwood could be used for the fingerboards, and you often see in the old violins, they have a light colored fingerboard and then lots of fancy inlay, so you can really see that against the light colored wood.
Right, right.
Boxwood
Right.
was used.
Yeah, but the basic bones of how violins and cellos are made have not really changed much since, well, at least like the 1600s, would you say? Yeah. Good question.
Well, other than the conservation lab where we are today, Diane would like to know, Carol would like to know, what do you consider the most ideal place to play in Colonial Williamsburg, acoustically speaking?
You have thoughts about
Oh,
this.
nice.
I know
Well,
you do.
I like to play in the Capitol building, House of Burgesses area. So we do concerts there sometimes, and that's my favorite place.
I'm more of a palace guy. I consider the Palace Ballroom my natural habitat. It's a very flattering. I like the Capitol as well. I personally think the Capitol is a little too boomy, maybe because I play a lower. My sound gets a little bit muddy there, although I do enjoy it. So
Interesting.
I think the Palace gives me a slightly more clean definition while still getting that nice flattering, reverberant acoustic. So
Also, the Apollo Room at the Raleigh Tavern, I forgot that, because that's kind of a close second to me. So the Capitol building, the Raleigh Tavern, Apollo Room, and the Governor's Palace.
I'm sticking with my guy. I'm a Palace guy.
Well, now to get to Diane's question, she would like to know what life was typically like for an 18th century musician. Would they typically stay in a prominent town or city, or did they travel sort of as a troupe?
Well, that's a good question, and we should clarify that we are really representing members of the gentry. You know, you can think of me as like an amateur gentleman. That would have been more the case here in Williamsburg. Williamsburg in the 18th century was too small to support a class of professional performing musicians. You'd have to go to a bigger city to find that. Philadelphia was a big musical metropolis, Charleston, another one at the time. There were, the occasional dance orchestras here in the Governor's Palace. In fact, we have records of Cy Gilliat, who was an African-American possibly a dentured servant, who was very well known in both Richmond and here in Williamsburg, as being hired by the governor's palace to lead the dance orchestra. He was active for decades. As far as what their lives would be like, I mean, listen, musicians were always hustling for a living, right? It's going from one gig to the next. So I'm pretty sure it was the same thing back then. If you were in a bigger city, I'm not sure, when did like the Philadelphia, you would know, you were from Philadelphia. When did the Philadelphia Orchestra founded?
Oh
Do
my
you know?
gosh, I don't know.
How long
that.
has
I
it been
was in
since
the
you
youth
thought about
orchestra.
that?
I was going to say there's some clues about, if you're talking about professional musicians, they did tend to, in Virginia, be traveling
Right.
musicians who gave
Yes.
lessons.
Yes.
So Philip Fithian, who was tutor to the Robert Carter family, kept a journal, and he talked about a Mr. Stadley who came to give lessons to all the children on violin, flute, and keyboard. And he said, what was it? He came he'd stay for 3 or 4 days, and he'd come to give lessons like every month or so, every 6 weeks maybe, and stay a few days at the home and living at the home with the family.
Right. Yeah, the
That's
traveling
another-
music master.
Yeah.
All right, we have one final question for you here from Sharon, who would like to know, are there CDs or other recordings of this 18th century music performed by you all that someone could purchase?
Sharon, what you need to do is write a letter.
Yeah, I'm not sure where you access these recordings now. They've been made over the years. There are lots of many. As I mentioned, this one on LP, although this was also done for CD. So there are lots of
There's
recordings.
been many done over the years,
very
not by our
lots of
current
them.
body of musicians, but as recently as like the early 2010s, right? Didn't Wayne put out something around
Yeah, that went right to, instead of packaging, the later CDs were put right on the internet, so you could download them, with,
Oh, really?
I am
Okay.
so out of touch, it's terrible. But there are many recordings that were used to, the thing is that they used to be available for sale in the gift shops of Colonial Williamsburg. I'm not sure if they're going back to doing that or not.
We had been talking about it, and then the pandemic happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, that kind of put a cramp in a lot of plans.
Yeah,
and
but
that
there,
was one of
yeah,
them.
there are a lot of
Yeah.
recordings. You kind of have to hunt for them. They're online in one capacity or another. You could go on the Colonial Williamsburg website and look for perhaps a list of the recordings.
Right.
All right, well, thank you both very much for answering these questions and giving us these wonderful performances today. This project was funded in part by a generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the generosity of our donors. Thank you. To learn how you can contribute to presentations like this, follow the links pinned in the comments below or join us at colonialwilliamsburg.org. Brady and Jenny, do you have any final statements or anything for us?
Can't
We
think of
appreciate you
anything.
spending this
Yes.
time with us.
Thank you all so much. It was really fun.
Oh, we're playing.
Again, I forgot. Well, should we play what we? We're going to go back to the beginning. This is Barbella again.
That's right. We didn't tell you the first piece we
That's
played,
right.
which was also by Barbella. This is the third movement of his first duet.